Mesopotamia. Benjamin R. Foster. Introduction. Sources. Mesopotamian religion includes certain beliefs and practices of the Sumerians, Acadians, Assyrians, Babylonians and other peoples who lived at various times in different parts of ancient Mesopotamia, the region corresponding roughly to modern Iraq, from the 4th through the 1st millennia BCE. The history and cultures of these peoples were mostly forgotten during the early Christian era, save for brief historical narratives of famous kings and cities in the Hebrew Bible, in classical authors such as Herodotus, Diodorus and Josephus, and in scattered excerpts from a lost book by Berossus, a Babylonian writing in Greek in the 3rd century BCE. Beginning in the 19th century CE, with the discovery and excavation of ancient Mesopotamian sites and decipherment of Mesopotamian languages such as Sumerian and Acadian, European and American scholars identified texts, objects and architecture as religious in nature. They used these to reconstruct ancient Mesopotamian religious beliefs and practices in the absence of any continuous or living tradition from ancient times to the present. Inevitably, the intellectual concerns of successive generations of scholars, their personal religious commitments and their individual stances, such as piety, skepticism or anticlericalism, had their effect on agendas of research and modes of presentation of Mesopotamian religion in modern studies. Many scholars of an earlier generation took for granted, for example, a higher degree of religious preoccupation and expression among ancient Oriental or Semitic peoples than among other ancient peoples such as the Greeks and Romans, but generalizations on this order are no longer the basis for serious research. Some scholars imagined, for example, that the priesthood was primarily responsible for preserving culture, while others claimed that priests resisted change and Map 4.1. Early Mesopotamia. Development suppressed writings unacceptable to them, and generally stood in the way of progress. Pioneering studies of Mesopotamian religion tended to be comprehensive, such as that by M. Jastrow, 1898, partially revised German edition 1912, with a volume of illustrations, 1912. Its fundamental thesis was that ancient Mesopotamian religion derived from local animistic cults that grew and merged into a larger, more complex interlocking set of religious practices and beliefs. Similar views were set forth by W. Rogers, 1908, in a volume that treated Mesopotamian religion as a sort of prelude to Judaism, itself a prelude to Christianity. E. Dorm, 1945, not available in English, wrote a concise and well-documented descriptive study. The most influential writer in English on Mesopotamian religion was Thorkild Jakobson. He developed a view that ancient Mesopotamian religion derived from a person's sense of the other in the natural world around him, leading to feelings of fear and awe. People perceived active will in natural events, processes and phenomena. This sense of the other was expressed, using metaphorical terms, in myth and theology and was acted upon in cult and ritual. We have a comprehensive presentation of his views, Jakobson 1976, and a later summary statement of his work, Jakobson 1987. Botero, 2001, stressed spiritual values and a phenomenological rather than a schematic, theoretical approach. For a summary of its main theses see Botero, 1992, 201-31. Economic and ritual aspects of Mesopotamian religion are presented by Oppenheim, 1977, professing disdain for a historical approach to the subject. He contributed a brief but suggestive essay to a collection edited by Firm, 1950, 65-79. A more detailed, primarily bibliographical survey was offered by Romer, 1969. There are numerous technical studies of aspects of Mesopotamian religion in the scientific literature of Assyriology, but few of them are in English. Many presentations of Mesopotamian religion rely on retellings of ancient literary works that modern scholars classify as mythology. Authoritative presentations of Mesopotamian and other ancient Near Eastern mythologies were made in Kramer, 1961 and 1969, as well as in a major treatment of Mesopotamian mythological texts jointly with Botero, 1989, not available in English. Recent English translations of Acadian mythology are found in Daly, 1989, and Foster, 1996. Important Sumerian myths and other religious texts are translated in Jacobson, 1987. No ancient Mesopotamian term corresponds to the modern concept of religion, nor is there any ancient scripture, systematic treatise or general description of religious belief or activity from any period of Mesopotamian history. This means that definition of Mesopotamian religion can at best be only a modern mode of selecting and interpreting ancient writings and material culture using modern humanistic categories for which there may not have been ancient counterparts. Although the Mesopotamians recognized certain matters as pertaining to the gods, a distinction between religious and secular matters may not have been always fully comprehensible in the context of Mesopotamian culture. History. Because this was before the invention of writing about 3300 BCE, evidence for Mesopotamian religion is derived from burials, architecture and artistic and utilitarian objects, including figurines, reliefs, seals and ceramics. The presence of grave goods in prehistoric burials, for example, suggests belief in some sort of existence after death. Statuettes of women with exaggerated torsos, breasts or genitalia suggest an emphasis on fertility and procreation. The earliest sanctuaries were single-roomed, clay and timber structures not much different from dwelling houses. These had a niche in one wall, where the deity was situated, perhaps in an image or symbol, with an offering table in front of the niche. In the marshes of southern Sumer, the earliest built sanctuaries may have been of woven reeds, but still in the form of a human residence. The Sumerians are the earliest identifiable population of Mesopotamia, though there is evidence for other peoples besides them. Sumerian urban culture was originally centered in the southern third of the floodplain of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. By the end of the 4th millennium, Sumerian settlements and colonies had spread north, first to Akkad, the region around present-day Baghdad, then as far as what was later Assyria, with outposts in the upper Euphrates Valley in northern Syria and in Anatolia, see Map 4.1, and Chronology, Table 4.1. Among the characteristics of late 4th and early 3rd millennium Sumerian urban culture was gigantic investment of labor and resources in the construction of sanctuaries and related buildings. An early sanctuary at Uruk, for example, was constructed on a massive irregular mud brick platform rising about 14 m above its foundations. On top of this platform stood a building about 17.5 m, with a central chamber running its full length, approached by staircases around the platform. Yet this sanctuary was only one of several in the city, another being nearly half as large again with stone foundations. The Uruk sanctuary buildings. Fig. 4.1. Pantheon of principal Mesopotamian deities. Were in some instances decorated with tens of thousands of stone and baked clay cones dipped in colors then inserted horizontally in the walls to form polychrome patterns. Temples were further decorated with recessed niches, reliefs, carved stone basins and other, more perishable and valuable, elements now lost, such as reedwork, weaving and metalwork. Religious art of the end of the 4th millennium shows an important male figure in a distinctive fringed garment who. Table 4.1 Chronology of Mesopotamian Civilizations. BCE. Mesopotamian Civilization. Religion. 6000. Local cultures in north, first settlements in south. 5000 to 4000. Villages and towns, subsistence economy. Small sanctuaries like houses, deities, aspects of nature with cosmic functions. 4000 to 3000. Growth of cities, especially Uruk, Sumerian colonization of Euphrates Valley to north, writing, monumental art and architecture, economy based on management and redistribution of surplus. Huge temples at Uruk, deities in human form with superhuman powers. 3000 to 2300. Semites in Akkad, Sumerians in Sumer, rival city-states and leagues, development of kingship, palaces, at Lagash, attempts to create a theocratic state ruled by king, Old Sumerian culture. Articulation of formal pantheon where each major Sumerian city was home to a different Sumerian god. 2300 to 2100. Sargonic dynasty unites Sumer, Akkad, Upper Tigris and Euphrates, southwestern Iran into an empire based in Akkad. Identification of Sumerian and Semitic deities, deification of reigning king, lavish royal patronage of temples. 2100 to 2000. Dynasty at your controls kingdom in Sumer and Akkad built from remains of Sargonic Empire. Sumerian religious literature, first construction of ziggurats. 2000 to 1500. Amorite settlement in Mesopotamia, Amorite city-states from Aleppo to Uruk, formation of Babylonian culture in Sumer and Akkad and Assyrian culture in Assyria, period of Hammurabi, civilization of Mari, Old Assyrian city-state. Beginnings of Babylonian religious literature, pantheon narrows to small group of leading gods in supreme control, Anu, Enlil, Ea, mother goddess, growing importance of personal god. 1500 to 1100. In Assyria, Hurrian rule, then emergence of Assyrian nation-state, 1350 to 1076, in Babylonia, Kassite rule, era of nation-states and internationalization of Babylonian culture, palace economies sustained by professional military elite. Decrease in number of gods with parallel increase in older divine names considered by names of major deities, tendency towards emergence of a single dominant god, such as Marduk in Babylonia and Asur in Assyria, but continuity with Sumerian past. 1100 to 900. Collapse of nation-states in Western Asia, growth of Aramean culture in North Syria and Mesopotamia. Few sources available. 900 to 612. Assyrian Empire unites Mesopotamia, Syria-Palestine, conquers Egypt, time of Asurnasurpal, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Assurbanipal, Assyria destroyed by Medes. Claims for universal rule of one deity, such as Marduk and Asur, henotheism, continuity with past. 612 to 539. Babylonian Empire takes former Assyrian territories, time of Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus. Archasing religious literature, theological speculation based on philology, such as minute analysis of divine names. 539 to 330. Under Persian rule, Babylonia is prosperous and cosmopolitan center of a vast empire from the Nile to Central Asia. Persian patronage of Babylonian temples, some destruction in times of civil unrest, continuity with past. 330 to 130. Babylonia prospers, a center of Hellenistic Empire of Asia, time of Alexander the Great and Seleucid rule in Western Asia. Last flowering of native religious culture in Sumerian and Acadian. 130 to Christian era. Gradual disappearance of Mesopotamian civilization, Euphrates loses position as cultural axis of Mesopotamia and becomes frontier between Rome and Parthia, decline in prosperity and population of Babylonia. Local worship of some Mesopotamian deities, such as Nabu, Nanaya, Asur, under Parthian rule, may have exercised both religious and secular authority, though the traditional term priest-king for this mysterious figure has been abandoned. From about 3500 BCE on, the fundamental element in every Mesopotamian temple was the cult chamber or cella, with a niche for the divinity in one side. In some small temples, this chamber constituted the entire structure, in others, there was an anteroom. More palatial structures included one or more courtyards, sometimes with subsidiary rooms along their sides. In some cellas the niche was on the short end of the chamber. These are referred to as long-room temples. In others, the niche was on the long side of the cellar. These are referred to as broad-room temples. Some temples were of the bent axis type, meaning that one entered the cellar from the side then turned 90 degrees to see the niche. In others, the niche was often already visible from a doorway to the outer court or anteroom. These elements vary by time and region and have been intensively studied by architectural historians to determine their source and course of development. Frankfurt 1996. After the end of the third millennium, Many larger temples included an independent temple tower, called a ziggurat. These had several stages and a chapel on the top accessible by stairways. Their terraces may have been planted with trees and decorated with symbols such as bull's horns, but the significance of these is uncertain. These towers rose high above other buildings in Mesopotamian cities. Mesopotamian urban centers of the 2nd and 1st millennia had many large and small temples. In 6th century Babylon, for example, there were at least 50 temples and 1,000 or more smaller chapels, images and altars throughout the city. Written sources for Mesopotamian religion begin in the mid-3rd millennium BCE. From these it is clear that polytheism, or worship of many gods, was the first outstanding trait of Mesopotamian religion. From later times the names of over 2,000 deities, male and female, in various Mesopotamian and non-Mesopotamian languages are recorded. Although the Mesopotamians recognized certain deities as more important than others, they did not exclude any deities, foreign or native, by considering them false or imaginary. A second outstanding trait of Mesopotamian religion was the belief that major gods resided in specific sanctuaries built for their service by human beings, in which the gods were present in more or less anthropomorphic form. Many of these sanctuaries were located at important Sumerian cities, such as the Temple of Enki at Eridu, of Inanna at Uruk, or of Nanna, the moon god, at Ur. Others, like the Sanctuary of the Birth Goddess at Kesh, a Sumerian cult center, location unknown, were apparently in rural areas. Sometimes two important gods had their sanctuaries in the same city. En, the sky god, and Inanna, goddess of procreation, both had major temples at Uruk, while there were major temples of both Ninurta and Enlil at Nippur. Linking these deities into families and generations became part of the cultural and political commonality of the various Sumerian city-states of the 3rd millennium, whereby they shared accounts of the gods' family relationships, their interactions, rivalries and heroic deeds. The Sumerians deemed their cities the center of the universe, with the great gods of the universe actually resident within them. The northern half of Mesopotamia was inhabited by peoples speaking Semitic languages, unrelated to Sumerian. The Semitic peoples of Mesopotamia shared both a bilingual cultural community with the Sumerians and a broad common cultural and linguistic heritage with other Semitic peoples across the Near East. Sumerian and Semitic-speaking cultures interpenetrated and converged into a bilingual unity. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, syncretism or identification of Semitic and Sumerian deities had begun. For example, Semitic Adad or Adu, god of thunderstorms, was identified with Sumerian Ishtar, the sun god of the Semites. Shamash was identified with the sun god of the Sumerians. Utu, Semitic Ea, god of wisdom and magic, was identified with Sumerian Enki, and Sin, the moon god of the Semites, with Sumerian Nanna. See Fig. 4.1. Since most of the evidence for these deities comes from periods after identification or syncretism had taken place, it is often difficult to identify the characteristics of the originally separate deities combined in them. With the development of political institutions such as kingship in the Sumerian city-states of the 3rd millennium BCE, as well as among the Semitic peoples of northern Mesopotamia, the gods tended to be reinterpreted as kings, queens, courtiers, military officers, advisors and messengers, along the line of human royal courts. Jacobson 1976, 75-91, Botero 1992, 212-15. This tended to overshadow their older functions as gods of nature in the village and pastoral societies of earlier times, though these were not forgotten entirely. Astral deities, such as the sun, the moon or the planet Venus, became kings or queens of heaven and were systematized in later times through astronomy and astrology. A few gods, such as Asur, at home on the bend of the Tigris River where the city Asur was to grow, were apparently deities resident in a specific locality, Newman Lockheed, without a broader function in nature. The chief of the Sumerian pantheon, Enlil, at home in his sanctuary at Nippur, is usually said to be a god of wind or air. Van Dijk 1971, 462-3, Jacobson 1987b, 453-4, but this is debatable. During the last quarter of the 3rd millennium BCE, the Sargonic, or Acadian Empire, based in Akkad, but extending to Syria and Sumer under unified rule, hastened and refined the syncretism of Sumerian and Semitic religions. An Akkadian princess, Enheduanna, composed Sumerian hymns to the temples of Sumer and in honor of Ishtar and the moon god, Hello 1997, 518-22. By the beginning of the 2nd millennium, Sumerian was disappearing as a living language and independent culture in the face of Acadian, and thereby acquired an academic character favored by small circles of the highly educated. An influx of peoples from northern Syria, called Amorites, brought new religious ideas and practices to Mesopotamia and closer cultural connections with the peoples living along the middle and upper Euphrates than before. Babylonia became the new term for the former Sumer and Akkad, reflecting the increasing importance of the city Babylon. In this period certain deities, such as Marduk, god of Babylon, and Nabu, god of nearby Borsippa, gained prominence. Non-Mesopotamian traditions, such as a battle of a hero god with the sea, a story of Syrian origin, entered Mesopotamia. After the mid-2nd millennium, Mesopotamia was divided into nation-states that elevated certain local deities, such as Marduk and Asur, into national deities, alongside foreign deities, such as Kassite Shukamunu, imported by non-Mesopotamian dynasties ruling in the land, including the Kassites and Hurrians. As the great gods seemed increasingly remote from the affairs of people not in positions of authority or prestige, belief in a personal, protective, intercessor deity expanded. Jakobson 1976, 145-64. An Acadian prayer to a personal god expresses both the personal and remote aspects of divinity. Foster 1996, 627. O my God, who created my name, guardian of my life, producer of my progeny. O angry God, may your heart be calmed. O angry goddess, be reconciled with me. Who knows where you dwell, O my God? Never have I seen your pure standing place or sleeping chamber. Throughout the 2nd and 1st millennia, the deities of such centers as Asur and Babylon were often associated with political and military activities, becoming in some instances gods of conquest and empires, commanding the subjugation of other peoples. However, Mesopotamian religion was not forcibly imposed on conquered areas. When in turn Mesopotamia was conquered by an outside people, the Persians, in the 6th century BCE, the national gods of the Babylonians and Assyrians began to diminish in stature with the decline of their cities and nations' political importance. At first the Persian rulers respected Mesopotamian sanctuaries and cults, but in times of rebellion and political turmoil some important sanctuaries were damaged or destroyed and never thereafter rebuilt. Few Mesopotamian deities, among them Nabu and Naniah, outlived the period of Hellenistic rule in Mesopotamia, 4th to 2nd centuries BCE, except when identified with Syrian or Greco-Roman deities, for example, Adad equals Jupiter Dolichaenos, Ishtar equals Astarte. By the time of the incorporation of Mesopotamia into the Parthian Empire in the 1st century BCE, the traditional Mesopotamian gods had disappeared forever, except in isolated enclaves such as Asur and Uruk. Pantheon. The many and the particular. The individual Mesopotamian recognized the existence of numerous gods, including deities foreign to his land and culture. In devotional expression and name-giving, where personal piety was expressed, he tended however to stress the importance of only one or a few deities, elevating the chosen one above the others in the rhetoric of his praise and attention, such as in the following addresses to the sun and moon respectively, after Foster 1996, 635, 665. O Sun, King of heaven and earth, Lord of truth and justice, Lord of the greater gods, Lord of the lesser gods, whose assent no god can change, whose command cannot be transgressed. O Moon, shining radiant God, luminary of heaven, firstborn son of Enlil, foremost one of Enlil's temple, you reign as King of the universe. You set your throne in the shining heavens. So too villages, towns or cities typically recognized one deity, or a small group of deities, as paramount in that locality, though at the same time they claimed universal dominion for the local deity and recognized the dominion of other gods. Botero 2001. Certain groups, such as pastoralists, farmers, hunters or fishermen, and certain professions, such as soldiers or woodworkers, may have favored certain patron deities, but there is little evidence for this. Systematization. With the broadening horizons of exchange, colonization, conquest, formation of leagues, city-states, nation-states and empires, ancient Mesopotamian theologians organized deities into pantheons, that is, constructs that were intended to order systematically numerous Mesopotamian gods. Lambert 1975. As early as the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, Sumerian lists of gods were compiled, arranging the deities into tribe-like hierarchies, with the elder gods first, then their children. In the early lists, the chief gods were An, the sky god, and Enlil, the chief god living on earth. Later Sumero-Acadian lists of the early 2nd millennium formed the basis for a large, systematic list called An, in Sumerian, equals Anum, in Acadian. This listed the various names of a given deity, those of the spouse, then their children with their families and retainers, then the retainers of the parent couple. This included nearly 2,000 names of deities. Some lists added explanations of the gods' functions and attributes. Documents such as these show how Mesopotamian scholars constructed a pantheon, or overarching hierarchy of the gods of Mesopotamia. Pantheons were organized in several ways. One ranged gods in large groups or generations. Thereby certain primeval deities were recognized, at least in literature, but there was no active cult or mythology for these deities, who were considered alive but remote. Primeval deities included, for example, pairs of gods mentioned at the beginning of the Babylonian creation epic, such as Lamu and Lahamu, Anshar and Kishar, but there were no temples to these gods nor prayers addressed to them. A second, related technique constructed genealogies whereby some deities were the spouses, children or descendants of others, visualized in human, or anthropomorphic, form. For example, in one tradition, the sky god An equals Anu, was the father of the moon god, Nana equals Sun, who was in turn the father of the sun god, Utu equals Shamash, and the planet Venus, Ishtar. Yet all of these gods were considered contemporaries and tended to differ in relative importance rather than relative age. According to a third technique, deities were assigned specific areas or regions of the cosmos, such as An equals Anu, in heaven, Enlil on earth, and Enki equals Ea, in the subterranean fresh waters. Since these gods were considered resident in their earthly sanctuaries and were also of universal dominion, they had, in effect, three positions: geographical, social and cosmic. A fourth technique was syncretism or identification of originally distinct deities, from different places or cultures. Thereby Sumerian Inanna was equated with Ishtar of the Semites, and Ningersu, local god of the city Gersu in Sumer, was equated with the better-known Ninurta of Nippur, one of Sumer's principal cities. Considerable variation in the pantheon is found in different periods and places, so Fig. 4.1 is only approximative. Some deities were ranked numerically by Mesopotamian scholars in that they wrote numerical substitutions instead of spelling the gods' names. In this approach, Anu was given the highest number, 60, the basis for Mesopotamian sexagesimal mathematics, as most important, Enlil 50, Enki 40, Sin 30, Shamash 20, Ishtar 15, Gira 10, and Adat 6, though variations occur. How or when these numerical values were assigned is unclear. Use of the numeral 30 to write the name of the moon god, referring to the number of days in the lunar month, seems to antedate the general practice of numerical substitution for divine names, so may have inspired it. The other numerals would therefore have been derived by analogy on the basis of the deity's relative importance. Modern researchers tend to group Mesopotamian deities according to broad functions in nature: weather gods, Adad, agricultural deities, Nisaba, Ninurta, gods of livestock, Sumerkan, or, in Mesopotamian fashion, gods of certain parts of the cosmos, such as Netherworld deities, Nergal, Ereshkigal. Other scholars group gods based on their relationship to human activities and concerns, such as birth goddesses, Mr, healing deities, Bau, Gula, Ninkarik, gods of magic, Asaluhi, Marduk, scholarship, Nabu, Nisaba, warfare, Ishtar, Zababa, divination, Shamash, Adad. Mesopotamians, while not referring to such categories in the abstract, followed a similar process in their tendency to identify deities assignable to these categories. A further division of the ruling gods was the recognition of two large subgroups, greater, Anuna, and lesser, Igigi, gods. It is not always clear what the distinction between these groups may have been. In Acadian texts of the later periods, the Anuna gods ruled in the netherworld and the Igigi gods in heaven, but this may be a secondary development. During the early second millennium, a leading group of three emerges among the great gods: Anu equals An, Enlil and Ea equals Enki, who seem to have exercised the most effective power in the universe. By the end of the second millennium, individual national gods, such as Asur and Marduk, were said to dominate the other gods. As the number of distinct deities diminished through time, the number of names assigned to the remaining deities increased. Marduk, for example, was assigned the names of various originally independent gods in the Babylonian Epic of Creation, Lambert 1990. Pantheons based on these ways of organizing the gods could be local and universal at the same time. They provided a means for ranking some deities in status ahead of others, based on human politics or cosmological speculation. Moreover, the pantheon included gods of human social relations, productive capacities, and other activities and achievements. Thereby human activities were incorporated into a cosmic unity that did not distinguish religious concerns from non-religious concerns so clearly as in modern societies with a sense of secular and sacred. In later periods there are isolated instances of henotheism, that is, describing certain individual gods as aspects or even bodily parts of a more important god, as in this hymn addressed to the Babylonian deity Marduk, Foster 1996, 598. Sin is your divinity, Anu your sovereignty. Dagon is your lordship, Enlil your kingship. Adad is your might, wise Ea your perception. Nabu, holder of the tablet stylus, is your learning. Although there were ideas of a supreme deity, who might gain power over the other gods by valor or by divine election, there was never a sense of exclusion of other deities, such as characterized later monotheistic religions. Individual deities. The highest-ranking deities formed the cosmic triad of Anu, Enlil and Ea, with sometimes a mother goddess of equal rank. Anu was the sky god, remote from human concerns, with little mythology, and few prayers or hymns addressed to him. His major sanctuary was originally Iana at Uruk, but this later became sacred to Ishtar as well, so Anu and Antum lived in another building nearby, the Bit Resh or chief household. An elaborate late 2nd or 1st millennium Sumerian poem explains that Anu promoted his daughter Ishtar to rule with him as Queen of Heaven, but the circumstances of her presence in Anu's sanctuary are not clear. There was a second sanctuary of Anu at Dur, a town in the foothills of the Zagros, and a joint temple with Adad at Asur. His spouse was Antum, mentioned in magical and astrological texts as well as in offering lists of the late periods, but she seems to have been replaced as spouse by Ishtar in many periods, at least in the active cult. Enlil was the major god on earth, with executive power in both heaven and earth. He held the tablet of destinies that controlled powers in both spheres. His sanctuary, as at Nippur in northern Sumer, was called Ika, mountain house. His name was sometimes used as a general term for supreme deity. In Assyria, he was identified with the god Asur as Assyrian Enlil. In the Babylonian Epic of Creation, Foster 1996, 350-401, his powers, or Enlilship, are given to Marduk, the Babylonian national deity. In the myth of Anzu, Foster 1996, 458-81, a monstrous bird steals them while Enlil is bathing but they are recovered by Ninurta, Enlil's son. Enlil was usually portrayed as harsh or indifferent to the human race. His consort was Ninlil, Assyrian Melissu, who was also honored as the spouse of the goddess Ur. Enki, Acadian Ea, was the god of subterranean fresh water, wisdom, the arts and magic. He was instrumental in creating the human race and was usually beneficent to people. He was known for his tricks, devices and elaborate rhetoric, and for his role in ongoing human culture, civilization and religion. His sanctuary was the Iabsu or House of the Watery Depths at Eridu, in southern Sumer. His spouse was Damgornuna. The Babylonian epic of creation makes him the father of Marduk. Wives of major gods were not usually seen as exercising individual power but were often called upon to intercede with their husbands and to placate their wrath in tender moments. The second-ranking group of gods were the astral deities, the moon, the sun, and the planet Venus as morning and evening star. Sin, Sumerian Nana, the moon, had major sanctuaries at Ur in Sumer and at Haran in southern Anatolia. He was a god of virtue and fair dealing, protecting the homeless, the wayfarer, widows and orphans. His spouse was Ningal, known as Nitkal in Aramaic and at Ugarit in Syria. Observation of the moon was essential for determining the Mesopotamian calendar and lunar eclipses were usually bad omens. Shamash, Sumerian Utu, the sun, was a warrior deity among the early Semitic-speaking peoples, with an interest in trade and commerce. Later he was primarily a god of justice, guardian of oaths, contracts, business, law and legal practice. He was important also as a god of truth in divination, which was often understood as a kind of judicial appeal. His daily course across the sky allowed him to see far and wide to the remotest places. No miscreant was beyond his rays. His major sanctuaries, called the Ebaba House of Radiance, were at Sippar and Lhasa in northern Babylonia. His spouse was Aya, goddess of the dawn. Ishtar, Sumerian Inanna, or Venus, was the sister of the sun and daughter of the moon, at Uruk and Nippur daughter of Anu. She was a complicated figure embodying love, sensuality and reproduction, characteristic of Inanna, as well as strife and warfare, characteristic of Ishtar, see Harris 1991. Her major cult centers in the north were at Assur, Nineveh and Arbela, where she was honored as a goddess of warfare, in the south at Uruk, as a goddess of sex and procreation. Aspects of her cult at Uruk, including self-mutilation, prostitution and sexual role reversal, were looked upon with revulsion by some Mesopotamians. As a goddess of battle, she had a major sanctuary at the city Agade, in northern Babylonia, called the Eulmash, meaning uncertain. Under the name Anunitum, battle goddess, she was honored at Sippar. She was a patron deity of the Sargonic dynasty, which created the first empire in Mesopotamia, and was said to have loved the Sargonic kings. In fact, the period of the Sargonic kings, with their capital at Agade, was sometimes referred to as the reign of Ishtar. Some Sumerian poetry portrays her as a girl falling in love for the first time, with Dumuzi equals Tammuz, a god of shepherding. Some Acadian poetry emphasizes variously her beauty, sensuality and interest in the needs of women. Other literary texts, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, Foster 2001, portray her as harsh, violent, vindictive, profane and sexually insatiable. Although some theology assigns her a husband and child, she was not normally reckoned as a mother goddess and did not have such clearly structured family ties as other Mesopotamian goddesses. The next major group of gods was comprised of gods of nature. These included the fire god Gira, Sumerian Jibal, often invoked in magic to destroy evil. Nusku was also a god of fire and torchlight. Ninurta was a god of vegetation and a warrior god. In Assur he was venerated as a god of warfare and the hunt. As son of Enlil he avenged his father when the monstrous bird Anzu stole his father's powers. His spouse was Gula, a goddess of healing. He was early identified with Ninjursu, a god of the Lagash region, and Gula with Bau, Ninjursu's spouse. Ninjursu and Ninurta had an especially rich mythology in Sumerian, important elements of which were borrowed into Acadian and later assigned to Marduk in the Babylonian epic of creation. Adad, Sumerian Ishtar, was god of thunderstorms and flash floods. In Mesopotamia, he was mostly considered destructive, because storms were often harmful to irrigation works and agriculture. He was also a god of divination. In Sumer, his major sanctuary was at Enlil, near Ur, in the north at Assur, Kala and Akalate, and further west at Halep, modern Aleppo. His spouse was Shola, possibly a name of non-Mesopotamian origin. As the weather god Hadad or Adu, Adad was better known in Syria than in Mesopotamia. Gods of the Netherworld included Nergal, king of the realm of the dead, and his spouse Ereshkigal. He was also a god of plague. His main sanctuary was the Meslam, house of the warrior of the Netherworld, at Kutha, in northern Babylonia, where he had a different spouse, Laz. He was sometimes equated with Era, a god of violence, warfare, pestilence and scorched earth. Among other gods of particular importance was Assur, the national god of Assyria, at home in the city Assur on the Tigris. With the expansion of Assyria into an imperial power beginning in the 14th century BCE, the god Assur was increasingly identified with warfare and empire building. The Assyrian king officiated as his high priest at his principal sanctuary, the Irusubkakara, mountain house of all lands, apparently an expansion of Ika, the name of Enlil's temple at Nippur. Assyrian theologians, in response to the Babylonian epic of creation, attempted to identify Assur with Anshar, a primeval deity, but the cult of Assur remained confined to Assyria itself and her military outposts. His spouse was Ninlil, Mulisu, or Sharua, a goddess of the dawn. Marduk, the national god of Babylon, may originally have been a storm deity. Through syncretism with Asaluhi, a god of magic, son of Enki, he became a god of healing and magic and took over many functions of Ea. His main sanctuary was the Temple Esagila at Babylon, a vast complex with a temple tower that was one of the largest structures of Mesopotamian antiquity. Marduk's spouse was Sarpanatum, originally referring to a town near Babylon and the poplar tree, but later etymologized as creatress of seed. Their son was Nabu, Nebo, whose major sanctuary was the Ezida, House of Truth, at Borsippa, south of Babylon. Nabu was a god of wisdom and literate scholarship. His cult enjoyed considerable prominence in Assur after the mid-2nd millennium. In the late periods, Nabu took over some of the names and functions of his father Marduk. His spouse was Tushmitum, a goddess of favorable attention to prayers and petitions, also Nanaya, a goddess of warfare and reproduction whose cult survived in Mesopotamia into the Christian era. Tammuz, Dumuzi, is usually explained as a youthful god of shepherding or of the date palm. Sumerian love poetry dwells on his adolescent courtship of the youthful Inanna. He was shallow and impetuous, she passionate and sensuous. Despite the efforts of his loving sister, Geshtinanna, he was killed and sent off to the Netherworld, to be mourned thereafter by the human race. Some scholars consider him a vegetation deity or god of fertility who was considered to have died in the hot summer months but returned in the spring, but this is doubtful. Others claim that he was a historical personage who was later worshipped as a god. Mother goddesses were largely known for their role in creation of the human race and supervision of birth. These included Namu, Aurora, Mumi, Ninmah, Ninhursag and Balaili, mistress of the gods. Deified natural features included the river god, important in judicial ordeals, resorted to when other means of ascertaining truth failed. The accused jumped into the river and if he came out safely was deemed vindicated. Many people considered themselves as having a personal god or goddess, without a name but referred to as god or goddess. This deity was supposed to look after a person's interests and to intercede on his behalf with more important deities. A few letters addressed to personal deities express reproof and regret that the deity has not been more effective in this role. Divine images, symbols and attributes. The major Mesopotamian deities were worshipped in the form of anthropomorphic images and also in the form of specific symbols such as animals, plants, implements or abstract shapes. For example, the crescent was the symbol for Sin, the 7-point star for Ishtar, the sun disk for Shamash, the lightning bolt for Adad, the horned cap for Anu or Enlil, the hoe for Marduk, the plough for Ninjursu, the flowing vase for Ea, the bull for weather gods, the lion for the warlike Ishtar, the staff with turban for Inanna or Ishtar as a fertility goddess. Certain objects associated with gods, such as weapons and musical instruments, were individually deified and accorded offerings, cells, in Finkel and Geller 1997. Gods also had standards or emblems that could be carried from place to represent their presence. In literature, gods were often described as holding specific objects, such as a scepter or a tablet stylus, representing their functions. In astrology and astronomy, gods were associated with specific planets, stars and constellations, for example Marduk with the planet Jupiter. Many gods and goddesses had specific monsters or beasts associated with them, such as a bull with Anu, a lion with Ishtar or a snake dragon with Marduk. Mythology. Properties of divinity. Although the gods were visualized in anthropomorphic form, with human emotions and physical needs and desires, important distinctions set the gods apart from humanity. First, they had transcendent divine powers in the universe, over other gods, and over human lives and institutions. Second was the gods' sublime position in an ordered universe, in which divinity could be expressed in terms of rank and precedence. Sublime power and position inspired fear, trembling and speechlessness in the presence of a god, Jacobson 1976, 3-5, Botero 1992, 210. Divinity was furthermore revealed by a radiant brightness, not as of heat but as of a gem-like sheen, blinding, pure and holy. This was sometimes seen as separate from the divine being, worn like a brilliant garment or headgear, or set about the features as glories. In art, this property could be represented by brightly colored inlays on the surface of figures, or rosettes or stars sewn on textiles. In poetry, this concept was expressed by words meaning or inspiring radiance and sublime purity. A distinctive aspect of Sumerian religious thought was the concept called me, literally is. This was an individual, differentiated, abstract power that defined and controlled both divine attributes and attributes of human civilization, Van Dijk 1971:442. Thus there was a me of individual gods, temples and lands, and of human institutions, states and accomplishments such as kingship, wisdom, music, old age or carpentry. According to the Sumerian myth of Inanna and Enki, Enki controlled these but Inanna got them away from him by getting him drunk, then taking them as gifts proffered in his intoxicated state, which he regretted when sober. Faber, in Hello 1997, 522-6. The concept of me did not carry over into post-Sumerian times, though there was an Acadian concept called Parsu which referred to the dynamic existence of gods and temples. Birth and death. A further property of divinity was immortality. In narratives about divine deeds, gods were understood to be born of the intercourse of male and female parents. There is reference to their being nursed as infants but no further indication of a sense of their education, training or personal development. Rather, as in the case of Marduk in the Babylonian epic of creation, the gods were born with full powers, knowing how to use weapons, understand magic words and so forth. As with Ninurta, a hero god, younger gods were expected to honor, obey and avenge slights to their parents. Having achieved a certain maturity, the gods stayed that way and did not age, though one and the same god could be portrayed as a youthful hero or as a sublime sage with magical, in preference to physical, prowess. Gods could die, but only at the hands of other gods. Some died in battle or were executed for offenses against higher gods. For example, the rebel god, Awila, in the story of the flood, Foster 1996, 160-203 and below, pp 184-5, 187, was executed to punish the uprising of the lesser gods against the great gods, but his spirit lingered on in the newly created human race, palpable as the human pulse. His flesh and blood were used to make the first human, and his will may have given the human race its rebellious or wayward spirit. The execution of Kingu, leader of the attacking army of gods and monsters in the Babylonian epic of creation, was modeled on this episode, but Kingu was there, falsely, accused of suborning Tiamat, mother of the gods, to kill her children. Foster 1996, 350-401. Gods in their dwellings. Just as a great king might exercise wide dominion in the world but needed to sleep and eat, so too the Mesopotamian gods were ascribed universal dominion but had physical, social and aesthetic needs that their human subjects were created to serve. Oppenheim 1977, 183-98. Thus temples of the gods were at first houses, then palatial structures where the god ruled as a householder and dignitary. Oppenheim 1961, 158-69. The god's house was provided with sleeping quarters, audience chambers, storerooms and dining halls in which choice foods were served and music performed. There were gardens for the gods' enjoyment and dalliance. Their homes were appointed in luxurious style with works of art, commemorative inscriptions and treasuries of offerings, gifts and valuables. The gods traveled to visit other gods and entertained each other with feasts accompanied by speeches and heavy drinking. Like any good householder, the gods were concerned with the stewardship of their domains. The Sumerian goddess Nanshi, for example, is described in a hymn as searching out fraud and embezzlement in her household accounts. Jacobson 1987a, 131, Heimpel in Hello 1997, 526-31. The gods were understood to be physically present at will in an image, Hello 1983, that was dressed and adorned with special clothing, jewelry and headdresses. Destruction of the image or its removal by an enemy was a disaster for the community, demanding a theological explanation. The deity was angry with his city or her people, even if no cause for this anger could be established, and had forsaken both the image and the community. Return of an abducted image was a moment of jubilation and renewal of patriotic feeling, as when the lost statue of Marduk was returned from its captivity in Elam by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar I, 12th century BCE. Some Mesopotamian authors speculated on the relationship between an object produced by human craftsmanship and a universal cosmic power, asserting, as in the Epic of Error, that the image was primeval and the craftsman uncanny, with later human counterparts permitted by the gods to make repairs. Foster 1996, 765. However, reports of theft of divine apparel or jewelry suggest that not all Mesopotamians were awed by images of the gods. Works and deeds. Whereas Mesopotamians believed that the gods controlled all events and processes in the universe, Mesopotamian literature preserved narratives of surpassing deeds of individual gods. One narrative pattern involved a warrior god who defeated a monster, often when other gods had tried and failed or were too frightened to attempt the quest. The victor was then acclaimed hero or even leader of the other gods. The opposing monster may have been a gigantic serpent or dragon, a monstrous bird or a mythologized volcano. In the latest version of this story, the Babylonian epic of creation, Dali 1989, 228-77, Foster 1996, 350-401, the monster was Tiamat or the sea, primeval mother of the younger gods, a portrayal said to be of Syrian origin, as the sea was of lesser importance in Mesopotamian thought than in Syria. This narrative type is sometimes understood as a Mesopotamian justification for absolute rule as necessary to ward off outside threats. Other narratives of divine deeds include construction of natural features of the landscape such as mountains or watercourses, or the erection of barriers, fortifications or cities, as well as the initiation of human cultural and political institutions. For example, a Sumerian poem describes how the god Ninurta reconstructed the bed of the Tigris River along the foot of the mountains, after Jacobson 1987a, 252. In those former days, the Tigris River did not rise splendid. It did not flow directly to the sea. It did not carry fresh, irrigation, water. The god Ninurta made a bank of stones against the mountain. These hovered before it, like drifting clouds on outstretched wings. He set this to be a barrier before the land, like a great wall. And the mighty waters ran along these stones. Crediting the gods with human achievements, such as instituting magic or monarchy, lent these human affairs prestige, antiquity and validity because Mesopotamians considered antiquity of human institutions a proof that they were favored by the gods. Cosmology. In literature and magic spells, Mesopotamians referred to the beginnings of the world. The various accounts were quite different, so there was no one story that should be considered standard or universally accepted. The most comprehensive and ambitious of the accounts of creation, contained in the Babylonian Epic of Creation, refers to a time before the present generation of gods in which there were two waters, male and female, commingling with no distinct separation. Rather than the chaos which it is often considered, this combination was dynamic and productive, yielding several pairs of older gods, male and female, and ultimately a much larger number of younger gods, on whom the narrative focuses. The successive generations of gods were progressively stronger and greater than the preceding ones, suggesting that the Mesopotamians visualized a dynamic past development of their universe, culminating in a present order that was stable and unchanging. Foster 1996, 350. When on high no name was given to heaven, nor below was the netherworld called by name. Primeval Apsu was their progenitor, and Matrix Tiamat was she who bore them all. They were mingling their waters together. No canebrake was intertwined nor thicket matted close. When no gods at all had been brought forth, none called by names, none destinies ordained, then were the gods formed within these two. The Babylonian epic of creation ascribed to Marduk, god of Babylon, the reorganization of the cosmos into the form the Babylonians knew it, including the motions of the stars, a firmament above the earth, rivers and mountains of the earth, the phases of the moon, and so forth. Since this account dates only to the second half of the second millennium BCE and presupposes a cosmos centered on Babylon, there is no reason to assign it universal validity in Mesopotamia. The poem appears to contain a variety of earlier materials worked into a coherent narrative. The universe was visualized as circular, with a firmament below heaven and a corresponding surface above the netherworld. Some speculative texts proposed several layers in the cosmos, Lambert 1975. In any case, heaven was so remote from earth that the land was not visible to a human observer who had risen so high, such as the mythologized King Etana, who flew up to heaven on an eagle, or the sage Adapa, who was summoned to heaven after interfering with the wind. In later periods, heaven and netherworld were thought to be organized like urban earth, with gates, defenses, and large residences for the gods containing reception areas, sleeping quarters, baths and other amenities. Above and below. Despite the basic tripartite division of the cosmos into heaven, earth and netherworld, Mesopotamian literature often referred to a bipartite division, above and below, in which below or earth may have included both the earth inhabited by humans and the netherworld, the two visualized as a unit opposite heaven. Earth had a five-part division, heartland, Mesopotamia, called the land, and the four cardinal directions, constituting inhabited territories, or the four quarters, Babylonian edges, of the earth. Beyond these lay oceans in all directions, in some cases separated from the inhabited world by mountain ranges. Far in the west, according to the Epic of Gilgamesh, Foster 2001, lay the waters of death, which separated the land of the living from a remote place where the survivor of the Deluge, Utanapishtim, lived with his wife. Mesopotamian literate culture generally viewed urban areas as safe, civilized and inhabited by gods. The intervening steppe was inhabited by wild animals and demons. Except for the sun, even the gods did not visit remote, uninhabited spaces. End of the world. Mesopotamia offers little evidence for a belief in a future end of the world. The only clear reference to this occurs in a 3rd century BCE work in Greek by Berossus, reputedly a Babylonian priest. He stated that the earth was in danger of ending in fire or flood when the planets were gathered in a straight line in the constellations Cancer or Capricorn. No earlier Mesopotamian reference to this belief has been identified, so its authenticity as a native Mesopotamian tradition is disputed. Although there are references to good and bad times and to the impermanence of political power in any one city or dynasty, these changes were described not as cyclical but as the result of divine favor or disfavor to individual rulers or their cities. The Mesopotamians viewed the world in which they lived as different from that of very ancient times, which were separated from the more recent past by the flood. The Mesopotamians believed that the flood would not recur, therefore, in effect the end of the world had already taken place. They expected the world to endure in the form they knew it, despite individual triumphs and destructions of cities and states. Since the flood had shown that the human race was essential to maintain the living standards of the gods might reduce the human population through plague or famine, but would never again attempt to eliminate it entirely. Gods and the human race. According to the Babylonian flood story, the gods created the human race in order for it to maintain them in a comfortable and luxurious living standard. In this account, the first human was made in collaboration by the birth goddess, Mummy or Nintu, and Enki, god of wisdom. They took a piece of clay, kneaded it with divine spittle, then mixed in the spirit, flesh and blood of a slain rebellious god. Foster 1996, 168. They slaughtered Awilu, who had the inspiration for the revolt against the gods, in their assembly. The birth goddess, Nintu, mixed clay with his flesh and blood. That same god and man were thoroughly mixed in the clay. For the rest of time they would hear the drum. From the flesh of the god the spirit remained. It would make the living know its sign. Lest he be allowed to be forgotten, the spirit remained. To sustain the human race, birth, maturity, marriage and procreation were instituted. Later, when the population had grown too great, celibacy, infertility, stillbirth and social restrictions against childbirth for certain groups of people were imposed on the human race. This was not the only Mesopotamian story of how human beings were created. In a Sumerian account, the god of wisdom produced various experimental but defective human beings until a satisfactory human was brought forth. Kramer 1961, 68-70. In another Sumerian creation story, human beings grew from the earth after Enlil struck it with a pickaxe. Then he handed them the pickaxe and they set to work. Faber in Hello 1997:511-13. In the Babylonian epic of creation, Enki's role in creating the human race is subordinated to Marduk, who is said to have had the original idea for it. Foster 1996, 383. I shall compact blood, I shall cause bones to be. I shall make stand a human being, let man be its name. I shall create humankind. They shall bear the God's burden that those may rest. Humans in Mesopotamian thought were differentiated from animals in that they ate prepared foods, such as bread and beer, in preference to uncooked wild plants and water. Humans, unlike animals, wore clothes and treated and adorned their bodies with alien substances, such as oils and cosmetics, and cut their hair, rather than letting it grow to a natural length. Humans were different from gods in that they had inferior mental and physical powers and had limited lifespans. What some later peoples deemed human characteristics, such as an immortal soul, language, social organization and use of implements, seemed to the Mesopotamians to be developments of human potential rather than distinguishing features of the race. Treatment of humanity. Although human justice was said to be pleasing to the gods, a gift of the gods, or of divine nature or origin, the Mesopotamians did not expect that their gods would necessarily treat them, their subjects, justly. The gods could be alternately protective and cruel, sustaining or harmful. The gods might reward good behavior or they might be exploitative, indifferent or capricious, as in this characterization of the Babylonian god Marduk, Foster 1996, 309. His scourge is barbed and punctures the body. His bandages are soothing, they heal the doomed. He speaks and makes one incur many sins. On the day of his justice sin and guilt are dispelled. Gods might take a sudden affection to a human, at least, certain kings sometimes claimed that this happened to them, guaranteeing their success as rulers. Gods might have long-standing individual friendships with humans, such as the sages Adapa and Atrahasis enjoyed with Enki, god of wisdom, but these were exceptional instances. Gods were expected to punish human wrongdoing, but this could not be relied upon. More than one Mesopotamian text reflects upon divine justice and wonders if proper service of the gods really promised a better human life or afterlife, or if divine favor simply came or went without predictable patterns of consequences. Foster 1996, 796. God does not block the progress of a demon. A father hauls a boat up a channel, while his firstborn sprawls in bed. What has it profited me that I knelt before my God? The Deluge. A major defining event in the Mesopotamian view of the history of the human race was the Deluge, known in several Acadian versions, Foster 1996, 160-203, George 1999, 88-95, Foster 2001, 84-9. This was considered a one-time, universal flood that changed human history forever. Although the Mesopotamians believed that certain familiar human institutions, such as living in cities, building temples and rule by kings, antedated the deluge, at the same time they believed that the correlation of biological and calendrical time was different before the flood from thereafter. Before the deluge, human beings lived immensely long lives, in some versions with long childhoods and adulthoods, in others with long adulthoods only. The flood was sent by the gods to diminish the human population of the world when their noise and clamor became intolerable to Enlil. So effective was the deluge that the human race was nearly wiped out, save for a flood hero, called Atrahasis or Utanapishtim, in Sumerian Ziusudra, who, at the urging of his friend Enki, built a boat, took on family and livestock, and was thereby saved from the catastrophe. Foster 2001:85. Wreck house, build boat. Forsake possessions and seek life. Belongings reject and life save. Take aboard the boat seed of all living things. The gods soon repented their deed in the face of devastation and hunger, so allowed the human race to repopulate, but with certain natural controls on productivity, and a normal lifespan of up to 80 years. The survivor of the flood was given immortality and removed to a location far beyond human existence, at the sources of the rivers. Death and the afterlife. Death in Mesopotamian religious thought did not mean the total extinction of the individual, only of the physical self and of those qualities of a person that made him productive and attractive to other human beings. Botero 1992, 268-86. A recognizable winged spirit, resembling a dove, passed to the Netherworld. This was a dreary, somber domain ruled by a pitiless hierarchy of deities and demons. There the spirit languished, often in hunger, thirst and misery, unless family or friends remembered to leave offerings of food and drink for the spirit to partake of and prayed for the spirit's rest and contentment. Foster 1996:403. Dust is their sustenance and clay their food. They see no light but dwell in darkness. They are clothed like birds in wings for garments. And dust has gathered on the door and bolt. A Sumerian poem recounting a visit to the Netherworld refers to the dependence of the dead upon the living. Foster 2001, 141. Did you see the ghost of him who has no one to make funerary offerings? I saw him. He eats table scraps and bread crusts thrown into the street. Ghosts and spectres of the dead could trouble the living, sometimes for no apparent reason, sometimes because they had not been properly interred or were discontented because of some human action or neglect. The city Cutha, in northern Babylonia, was considered the city of the dead and the center of the cult of death. The Netherworld was organized like an earthly or heavenly kingdom, surrounded by walls with 7 gates. Lambert 1990. A popular Mesopotamian poem, Daly 1989, 163-81, Foster 1996, 410-28, told how the Netherworld had once been ruled by a queen alone, Ereshkigal, but that she eventually found a husband, Nergal or Era. In one version of the story, he forces himself into the Netherworld by violence and threatens her into submission. In another, he breaks her loneliness and sexual frustration with a passionate relationship that finally results in their marriage. The gods of heaven and Netherworld, separated, according to the Babylonian epic of creation, into 2 groups of 600 each, could not visit each other, though they could exchange messengers. Even the great gods feared the Netherworld, which barred countless human dead from swarming onto the earth to devour the living in their eternal, unsatiated hunger. The dead entered the Netherworld naked and relinquished all hope of returning to life. How their ghosts escaped to plague the living is not clear. Various Mesopotamian stories told of human beings who learned what happened after a person died. In one, the Sumerian hero Enkidu volunteered in a fit of bravado to go down to the Netherworld to retrieve a favorite athletic object of the king, Gilgamesh. This was apparently a stick and a ball or puck that had fallen down there at the pleas of the people who were oppressed by the violent game that made use of them. The losers resented Gilgamesh's bullying tactics in the game. Enkidu recognized his relatives and saw certain distinctions among the dead. Heroes were treated better than common folk, for example, and stillborn children had a sort of play area with miniature furniture. He barely escaped alive and forgot in the stress of the moment to bring back the objects. Foster 2001, 129-43. Much later, an Assyrian dignitary described a vision of the Netherworld that included an array of monsters, composites of humans and animals in shape. He, like Enkidu, recognized a dead spirit, but fled in an ecstasy of terror and grief, narrowly escaping permanent confinement. Foster 1996, 715-22. He darted out into the street like an arrow and scooped up dirt from alley and square in his mouth, all the while setting up a frightful clamor, "Woe! Alas! Why have you ordained this for me?" Mesopotamians honored the dead of their families with a regular ceremony of remembrance and offering. Dead and sometimes even living kings were accorded divine honors and observances in special sanctuaries. Rulers and other powerful people could be buried in lavish tombs with grave gifts, perhaps more as a splendid way of dying than out of hope that they would need such gifts in the afterlife. Some Sumerian rulers had chariots, animals and even court attendants buried with them. Assyrian queens might be buried with their finest jewelry. Clay or metal vessels might hold food, drink and cosmetics. Burial might be in vaults in royal palaces, under the floor of homes, especially for children, or in cemeteries outside the city. Graves were not marked on the surface, so far as is known, and funerary inscriptions, naming the deceased or invoking blessings upon them from future descendants or passers-by, were very rare. One literary text describes an excavation to open an ancient tomb and the horrible shock the investigators felt when they beheld and reflected on the fate in store for them. Foster 1996, 436. One of the major literary achievements of ancient Mesopotamia, the Acadian epic of Gilgamesh, George 1999, Foster 2001, tells the story of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, who sought immortal life. This was based on older Sumerian poems about various episodes in Gilgamesh's life. In the epic, Gilgamesh's beloved friend, the wild man Enkidu, dies as the result of an expedition to achieve eternal fame for Gilgamesh by slaying a distant monster and cutting down a great tree. Terrified of dying himself, Gilgamesh abandons all in a desperate quest to find the survivor of the flood, Utanapishtim, to ask him his secret of immortality. Gilgamesh eventually reaches Utanapishtim after unexampled heroism and hardships, not to mention the timely intervention of several kind-hearted women, but learns that his hope is vain. Utanapishtim was granted immortality for surviving the flood, but this was a one-time event that would not be repeated for Gilgamesh's sake. Neither he nor any other human being had any hope of achieving immortality. This poem was popular in learned circles. Manuscripts have turned up throughout Mesopotamia, and from Syria and Asia Minor, dating to a time span of 1,500 years. There was no Mesopotamian paradise, no return of the soul in another body for another life, no judgment, and no sense that death might eventually end in a final consummation. Some Mesopotamians responded to this outlook by suggesting that the good for a human being was to enjoy life, love, family and vitality while they were within reach, for even a modest life was better than a grand death, as a tavern keeper advises Gilgamesh, Foster 2001, 75. When the gods created mankind, they established death for mankind and withheld eternal life for themselves. As for you, Gilgamesh, let your stomach be full. Always be happy, night and day. Make every day a delight. Night and day play and dance. Your clothes should be clean. Your head should be washed. You should bathe in water. Look proudly on the little one holding your hand. Let your mate be always blissful in your loins. This, then, is the work of mankind. Demons, ghosts, monsters, protective spirits. In addition to the gods, the human race and animal life, Mesopotamians recognized divine classes of beings, mostly harmful to the human race, which could be described as demons, often with human shapes but hideous or distorted features. Black and Green 1992. Most demons were not individuals with personal names, but belonged to a class or type, like a wild animal, referred to by general term, lurker snatcher or the like. An exception was Lamashtu, an evil goddess expelled from heaven who pursued the human race, causing infant death, disease and unhappiness in family life. Foster 1996, 850. She touches the bellies of women in labor. She yanks out the pregnant woman's baby. She roars like a lion. She keeps up the howling of a demonic dog. Demons might lurk in unfrequented spots to attack the unwary or might sneak into people's homes, like serpents through crevices, to work their will. They might physically seize upon a person, clutching, twisting or hitting him, to cause pain, sickness and dysfunction such as paralysis, mumbling speech or twitching. They might startle or terrify a person by strange noises or sensations, or rob them of vitality, beauty, energy or health by hostile staring and malevolent stalking. They could attack animals as well, silently dogging their footsteps to bring lameness, fever or distress upon them. Demons had no emotions and needed no rest, sleep or sustenance. Foster 1996, 833. They are drifting phantoms. They take no wife, they beget no son. They know neither sparing of life nor mercy. They heed no prayers or entreaties. Some demons were ghosts of a person's family or ghosts of people who had never enjoyed a fulfilling life, such as familial or conjugal love or sexual satisfaction. These were thus doomed to harass a happier humanity in their perpetual discontent. Human beings could protect themselves from demons through the intervention of a beneficent guardian spirit through prayer to the individual deity who was supposed to be concerned with their welfare, and through rituals and magic that could harm the demon, or drive or entice it away. Foster 1996, 832. Make the evil eye cross 7 rivers. Make the evil eye cross 7 canals. Make the evil eye cross 7 mountains. Take the evil eye and tie its feet to an isolated reed stalk. Monsters were visualized as composite creatures, made up of elements of bulls, lions, serpents, birds of prey, bisons, fish and human beings. Black and Green 1992. Mesopotamian art was highly successful in representing organically credible composite beasts. Literary descriptions of monsters are known, including, for example, men with heads or limbs of lion, fish, scorpion, bull or bison, as well as various kinds of dragons. Although most were harmful and terrifying, some could be beneficent to the human race, so that images of them were used to protect major public buildings, such as the royal palace or temples, from outside harm. The Babylonian epic of creation describes how Tiamat, mother of all the gods, formed monsters as part of an army to kill her offspring, the younger gods. In general, however, demons and monsters were taken for granted as part of the universe with which weaker humans had to contend. Demons and monsters could be defeated and killed by hero gods. They were seen as a frightening and baleful presence that one hoped to avoid wherever possible. Protective spirits were sometimes personified human qualities, such as talent, ability to succeed and the instinct for self-preservation. These were referred to as Lamassu and Shidu, Oppenheim 1977:198206. Images of Lamassu were placed near the entrance of ceremonial buildings to protect the occupants of the building from harm. These spirits were not prayed to specifically, but were supposed to be vigilant to protect a person's interests, health, professional advancement and similar concerns. Religious institutions in human society. The temple was constructed as the personal residence of the deity, the divine family and divine servants, and was often described as a physical link between the world of the gods in heaven and the world of the human race on earth. A Sumerian hymn expresses this as follows, after Jacobson 1987, 380. House, great tiara thrust up into the sky. House, rainbow thrust up into the sky. House, whose lordly tiara is worn in innermost heaven. Whose foundation is set in the depths below. Within the temple were living quarters for its permanent human residents, including priests and priestesses, administrators, and dependent workers and slaves. Some priests and administrators lived in their own homes, often in a superior residential area near the temple complex. There were some public areas of the temple, such as courtyards and gardens, where anyone could approach the deity with regular offerings, individual prayers, petitions and gifts. Other areas, such as the cult chamber, were accessible only to certain members of the temple staff, such as priests or temple workers. Temples were usually the largest and most imposing structures in a community, symbolizing its wealth and success. Krauss 1990. Babylonian temples often controlled important economic resources, such as arable land, livestock, precious metals, timber and other commodities. Temples could therefore act in the community as proprietors, investors and employers, numbering among their personnel privileged and educated members of the community of free citizens, who might serve as priests or other professionals, as well as outcasts of society, who performed menial tasks. Temples could lease out land and livestock to entrepreneurs, for in some areas, such as Uruk in the middle of the 1st millennium BCE, the temples owned enormous tracts of land, thousands of head of livestock and extensive orchards. From the end of the 3rd millennium on, temple resources were increasingly managed by agents of the king, but the temples still retained ultimate ownership. Northern Mesopotamian temples could act as banks, making loans or advancing resources to speculators or those in need. As an important emotional and spiritual focal point of the community, temples provided divine sanctions for human activities where recourse to the divine was called for. Oaths to establish truth and to promise adherence to the terms of contracts and treaties might be administered in the temple or in the presence of divine symbols. Temples provided social services, such as maintenance and employment for the destitute and handicapped or the children of poor families who might otherwise find no productive place in human society. Some people, especially children, might be given as a pious act to a temple or dedicated to work as servants to a god, often in times of personal or economic distress. Temples might serve as a community storehouse and treasury for the safekeeping of valuables and important records. Temples attracted the services of a literate, specialized elite. At the early 2nd millennium cities of Ur and Nippur, for example, members of the temple staff operated private academies in their homes to teach Mesopotamian learning to the future ruling class of the community, at the same time inculcating the values and common experiences of management and leadership. There is no evidence that temples maintained schools of their own. In 2nd and 1st millennium Babylonia, the custom grew of buying and selling prebends or allotments of temple offices, offerings and income, sometimes in minute shares. Perhaps the buyers of such shares in temple offices gained economic benefits, or perhaps they sought prestige by participating in an important urban establishment. Perhaps two temples needed to convert some of their prerogatives to cash. The temples were supported by the income from their own resources, by a regular tithe or temple tax levied on the population, including the king, and by regular deliveries of food, livestock and other commodities provided by the king. Individuals could make gifts as the result of vows or in gratitude for some success, such as a commercial venture. Kings presented temples with monuments commemorating their deeds. Many of these were open to public inspection in temple courtyards and stood as an important statement of royal ideology. Construction, adornment and restoration of temples was a fundamental duty of monarchy throughout Mesopotamian history. In 2nd millennium Babylonia, some temples, such as the Temple of the Sun God at Sitpar, included residential complexes for sequestered women of local wealthy families. These have sometimes been compared to the cloisters of the Christian world. The women, called nadatu, fallow, often owned substantial property through inheritance, which they increased through long, active careers in business, using agents. Being married to the deity, they took no human husbands and bore no children, apparently lest they alienate important wealth from the paternal family. However, these women sometimes adopted younger cloistered women or sons to care for them in their old age and willed to their adopted children their well-furnished homes in the temple complex and their often valuable estates, to the chagrin of the paternal family. There is no evidence that these women played any sacerdotal role, nor is it clear whether or not they could leave the cloistered complex at will. Priesthood. A broad class of professional people approached the gods directly. In the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia, major male gods had a high priestess and female gods a high priest. At the Sumerian city of Ur, for example, the high priestesses of the moon god were women of royal birth who served the god for their entire lives. Letters and poetry attributed to these women show their high social importance, deep religious feeling and impressive educations. They lived in a residential complex within the temple and officiated at rites as the chief and closest human being to the divinity. In later Babylonia, high priestesses are less well known. And some gods, such as Marduk, had only a high priest. In Assyria, on the other hand, the king acted as high priest of the principal god Asur, representing the Assyrian community to its god. The king wrote formal accounts of his deeds addressed to the god Asur in letter form, perhaps read aloud to members of the government. Assyrian deities other than the god Asur seem to have had their own priesthood. Large temples had an elaborately articulated hierarchy of cultic personnel, such as performers of laments and penitential prayers, purifiers and other specialists. Some of these were literate, and in some temples they were part of a controlling family group. These were allowed to enter inner areas of the temple and were entitled to income and support from the offerings to the deity. The temple staff included many people who were not specialists in cultic matters, such as shepherds, cooks, doorkeepers, courtyard sweepers, and others who participated in the day-to-day operations of the large building complex and estate. In the first millennium, major temples had gangs of slave workmen in addition to dependent and handicapped people who worked in the orchards and gardens. Some temples sustained women without husbands or paternal family connections. The role of these women in society is not clear. Some may have worked as midwives or taken care of orphan children, while others may have engaged in prostitution, but there is little evidence for this. Their status as temple dependents might be indicated by distinctive ways of dressing their hair, but this is uncertain. Dozens of titles of temple officials from various periods are known. In the first millennium, there is reference to a kind of collegium of priests, as well as to an assembly of the temple staff and other free citizens which adjudicated non-capital offenses, such as theft of temple property, assault, public drunkenness and improper liaisons with temple women. In later Babylonia, large temples included a royal steward to represent the king's interests in the temple economy, and the king could lease out large areas of temple land to entrepreneurs on his own volition. Prophets and oracles. Outside the ranks of regular temple staff, particularly in the Syrian city of Mari during the early 2nd millennium BCE, there is ample reference to prophets and ecstatics who spoke directly on behalf of the gods. Durand 1988, 377-452. Some of these people, both men and women, went into a trance-like state and recounted visions, along with the speech of the gods. Others seem to have had their prophetic state induced by the administration of beverages. Their utterances tended to be brief, in poetic language, and focused on affairs of state and matters affecting the king. Foster 1996, 213-14. They will put you to the test with a revolt. Watch over yourself. Set in position around yourself trustworthy servants whom you love, so they can watch over you. You must not go anywhere by yourself. But those men who would put you to the test, I, the goddess Anunitum, will deliver these men into your power. The veracity of prophetic speech was checked by divination. The spoken prophecies normally lack the ethical content associated with the biblical prophecies and often exhorted the king to take care of himself and to beware his enemies. A few instances of gods responding in written form to prayers and petitions are also known from northern Mesopotamia. Prophecy seems to have been more characteristic of the northern Semitic-speaking world than of Sumer or even Babylonia. In Assyria in the first millennium, oracles from a god or goddess were addressed directly to Assyrian kings, promising them protection from their enemies. Parpala 1997. Like the prophecies from Mari, these could make use of striking figurative language intended to be intimate addresses to the ruler. How these were delivered is unclear, perhaps through ecstatics or through voices heard by the king when he was in the sanctuary. Foster 1996, 712-13. Fear not, Assurbanipal, I, the god Nabu, will give you long life, I will entrust fair breezes with your spirit. This, my eloquent mouth, will ever bless you among the great gods. Celebrations of religion in human society. Devotion. Mesopotamian devotion is best known from personal names, many of which contained the names of gods, together with a prayer or statement of praise or blessing. O sin, accept my entreaties, my ear is listening for Aya, my God is like my father, Ishtar is gracious, I saw her greatness, Asur is my trust. Analysis of personal names shows that although many gods were known in the pantheon, far fewer occurred as elements in name-giving. Deities appearing frequently in names included Ishtar, Sin, Shamash, Ea, Marduk, Asur and Nabu. Certain gods' names were found in certain regions, such as Dagon on the upper and middle Euphrates, but less commonly in Babylonia, or Anu, the use of whose name greatly increased in late Babylonian Uruk. The name of the local city god, such as Marduk in Babylon, tended to predominate in names of that region. Short expressions of piety, such as blessings, were standard in salutations but were less frequent in the body of letters, for example, so it is difficult to gauge their importance in common speech outside of formulas of politeness. Short prayers can occur in the inscriptions on mundane objects such as cylinder seals, especially during the second half of the second millennium BCE. Impressions of these seals were used to indicate ownership, authenticity and authority in documents, fastenings of doors, packing materials and the like, so the prayers may have been more conventional than deeply felt expressions of devotion. Rituals, observances, offerings, festivals. Formal service to a deity entailed specific rites and rituals, both spoken and performed. These commenced in a state of ritual purity achieved by washing or lustration and sprinkling the floor with clean water. Formal actions included burning incense, making food offerings and libations, scattering flour, making gestures with the hands, facing in certain directions, or laying out objects, such as pieces of cloth, twigs or dishes. Some rituals called for fabrication of objects such as figurines, normally of clay or paste, and manipulating them. Many rituals were long and complicated, requiring considerable preparation, memorization of prayers and spells in Sumerian and Acadian, and careful performance by trained specialists. A fundamental principle of divine service was regular and extensive consumption of commodities by the gods in the form of food, sacrifices and offerings. At Uruk in the first millennium, for example, major gods were served 2 major and 2 minor meals a day. The divine diet might include, at different times and places, cooked meats and fish, vegetables, salt, baked goods such as breads, dairy products such as cheese and butter, beverages such as beer, ale and wine, and sweets such as honey and sweet cakes, accompanied by recitations, music and aromatics. The table was ritually set and cleared and the priests, sometimes the king, officiated. There were also banquets on festival occasions. A festival called Akitu, known already in the 3rd millennium, may originally have been associated with the equinoxes. The city god left his city in procession, sojourned briefly in a special building outside the city walls, then returned in triumphal procession again. By the 1st millennium, this festival was associated with the New Year, which occurred in the spring. Local versions of its elaborate rituals are known from Assur, Babylon and Uruk, mostly from tablets dating after the 7th century BCE. The New Year's ritual from Babylon, for example, began with washing by the officiants, opening doors to the temple, fabrication of figurines to be ritually beheaded on the 6th day of the festival, and recitation of prayers. On the 4th day the Babylonian epic of creation was recited. Towards the end of the festival, the king participated, laying down his scepter before the god Marduk. The officiating priest slapped the king's face and pulled his face to the ground by the ears, while the king spoke words of submission to Marduk and his temple. Later the king was slapped again. If tears came to his eyes, this was considered a favorable omen. No one knows if this ceremony was ever fully carried out as described or if many kings submitted themselves to these indignities. The high point of the festival remained the procession of the god, which moved through richly decorated streets on an established route from the festival house to his sanctuary, Cohen 1993, 400-53. Abundant documentation attests to sacrifice of live animals. For some rituals these were carefully selected by age, fatness, diet, sexual experience, state of their horns, color and so forth. Cattle and sheep were most often used for this purpose. These were slaughtered by a professional slaughterer in the ceremony and the carcass divided among temple personnel according to specific rules. Victims could be offered in gratitude, as substitutes for divine punishment or for divination purposes. In divination a question was posed of the gods of divination, such as Shamash and Adad, then after a vigil the animal was slaughtered and the entrails, gallbladder and liver were examined for certain marks or configurations of ominous significance. Oppenheim 1977, 206-27. There were regular and freewill offerings presented by private citizens, administrators and the king. These included agricultural products, livestock, clothing and valuable objects of wood, metal and stone. Individuals were supposed to set aside for the gods on some occasions portions of their own meals. It was considered an affront to the gods to eat these. First fruit offerings celebrated the harvest and yield of livestock. Thank offerings for vows and ventures were also made, such as model ships for the successful completion of commercial voyages. In addition to consumption as food or gifts, various commodities were burned, such as incense, to draw the attention of a god to prayer about to be made. For example, some temples had a basket or box for small, freewill donations made as an act of virtue. Individual gifts of objects, such as bowls, stands, weapons, furniture or statues to the gods were common practice at all periods. Many were expensive objects engraved with a prayer for the dedicant's life or with a statement of the name of the dedicant and a record of his donation. Some dedications add the name of a ruler or patron. Dedications by both men and women are known. Royal dedications were usually more lavish, for the presentation of which poetry and formal commemorative inscriptions were commissioned. In early 2nd millennium Babylonia, when years were named in honor of a major event of the preceding year, numerous year names commemorated objects, weapons, sculpture and major pieces of furniture prepared for gods, temples or the priesthood. Formal verbal expressions of piety and religious feeling are found in numerous prayers in Sumerian and Acadian. Prayers may contain petitions for a favor, reminding the deity of a deed of a loyal servant, or they may express contrition for evils done and obligations not met. Sometimes specific evil deeds are alluded to, but more commonly the petitioner professes to be unaware of the cause of the deity's anger against him. Foster 1996, 670-1. I do not know what wrong I have done. I do not know what sin I have committed. I do not know what abomination I have perpetrated. I do not know what taboo I have violated. Prayers usually contain praises for the divinity, stressing the god's power, valor, position of leadership among the gods, and sometimes the god's merciful nature as well. Some prayers conclude with a promise, not for better behavior, but for glorification of the mighty deed the god has done in forgiving the petitioner and removing the punishment for his sins. Some prayers conclude as well by asking for the benevolent intercession of the god's wife or of other gods. Occasionally prayers were written out in letter form, others were evidently spoken or performed. Goddesses were generally considered potentially more forgiving than gods. Prayer to the gods on ritual occasions often had a tone of appeasement. Sorrow, hope and penitence. The dominating mood was one of formality and anxiety. For rituals involving an all-night vigil, a special type of prayer addresses the beings of the night sky and reflects on the loneliness and solemnity of the occasion, when the rest of the community is asleep. Hymns of praise were composed for numerous major gods, including stars and planets. These were intended to be sung by single voices and by choruses. Some manuscripts make allusion to performance with brief notations such as its antiphon, but nothing is known of the performance techniques or even what musical instruments were used. In addition to praise of the divinity, some hymns may contain petitions for the city or the reigning king. Some hymns contained narratives of the god's deeds or allusions to cultic changes, such as exaltation to new status. Others were so general in nature that the same hymn could be used for different gods. In the 2nd millennium BCE, elaborate hymns up to 200 lines in length combined different styles and compositions about a deity into large, composite works that are sometimes called literary or great hymns. Whether or not these large texts had a liturgical use is not known. A distinctive form of praise for female deities was the hymn of self-praise, in which a goddess sings of her beauty, valor, lofty responsibilities, learning and other accomplishments. Foster 1996:486-94. Hymns, like personal names, invoked only a small number of deities within the larger pantheon, scarcely 30 out of many hundreds, with preference to the more important ones, such as Ishtar, Marduk, Sin, Shamash and Nabu. Letters and other records occasionally refer to rituals and observances that private people or families might perform, but their purpose and procedure are mostly unknown. Some of these included honoring the dead of the family, expressing hope or thanks for good health and happiness, seeking the cause of some misfortune or seeking to avert portended evil. Such rituals might require the purchase of materials not commonly found in the home. Calendars of favorable and unfavorable days include simple rituals anyone could perform. From the late 3rd millennium, a vivid picture of the rituals carried out, over many days, for the consecration of a new temple is provided by the Temple Hymn of Gudea of Lagash, Jacobson 1987a, 386-444. A few major rituals from the late periods are known in some detail, such as for the Babylonian New Year's festival, and rituals for the reconstruction of a temple, the putting into cultic service of certain objects such as statues, weapons or musical instruments, and the cleansing of impurities from the person of the king or from the temple precincts. In a ritual scholars call the sacred marriage, the king had intercourse with a woman, perhaps a priestess, representing a goddess, Kramer 1969. The poetry celebrating this ritual suggests that it took place in the early spring to guarantee fertility in the land. Any male offspring of such a union could be heir to the throne and claim divine parentage. The hymns of this ceremony showed that it was carried out with the joy and solemnity of a royal marriage. It is best known from sources dating to the end of the 3rd and the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE, with scattered allusions to it in later periods. In a ritual known as the substitute king, a ruler sought to avoid misfortune presaged in omens by setting a substitute, perhaps a condemned person, on the throne for a limited period, who bore the misfortune or was killed if he was still alive at the end of the period. Botero 1992, 138-55. The 7th century Assyrian king Esarhaddon, for example, dressed as a farmer for this ritual, and official letters were directed to the farmer. Public festivals and processions occurred at regular intervals throughout the year. In some, the whole community participated, dressed in holiday clothes and watching a procession of the god's image through the streets or by boat through a canal on a ritual journey to another sanctuary. The image was splendidly attired and the mood seems to have been one of display and exhilaration. Some festivals included athletic events in honor of a god or goddess, dancing, and dramatic performances. Others entailed consumption of special seasonal or holiday foods. For most of these occasions, little is known beyond their names and the general idea that they were in honor of certain deities. These festivals were provided for in the calendar, which was based on a lunar year of 12 months, but included extra days from time to time in order to keep the calendar in accord with the seasons. For religious sanction of occasions not on the calendar, belief in favorable and unfavorable days and propitious weather conditions led to the construction of hemorrhologies and monologies, that is, calendars or tables of good and bad occasions for business, journeys and family activities, and for state events, such as military campaigns, as well as important ceremonies such as parades and coronations. Ethics, piety. Mesopotamian literature did not hesitate to present the gods in ways that would be discreditable to human beings, such as being deceitful, intoxicated or irrational. These portrayals need only mean that the Mesopotamians did not expect their gods to be more ethical than they, only more powerful. At the same time, ethical and moral behavior was considered honorable for a human being, likely to win favor from the gods just as among the human community. Religious ethics included honesty and fairness, truthfulness, and generosity towards less fortunate members of society. Some ancient texts elaborate on these themes, discussing at length such matters as perjury, fraud in business, abuse of power, theft and sexual license, asserting that these would be punished by the gods in due season, but acknowledging, in some instances, that such punishment did not always occur. For most people, religious duty and piety consisted of regular libations and food offerings, prayer, observance of holy days and festivals, holding prescribed rites, teaching dependence reverence and worship, and not invoking the name of a god lightly or falsely. Neglect of these matters could result in divine displeasure or punishment. Foster 1996, 312-13. Like one who had not made libations to his god, nor invoked his goddess with a food offering, who was not wont to prostrate, nor seen to bow down, from whose mouth supplication and prayer were wanting, who skipped holy days, despised festivals, who was neglectful, omitted the god's rites, who had not taught his people reverence and worship, who did not invoke his god, but ate his food offering, who snubbed his goddess, brought her no flower offering, like one possessed, who forgot his Lord, who casually swore a solemn oath by his God. I was unjustly punished like such a man. Skepticism, Impiety. Mesopotamian written tradition did not admit openly expressed doubt as to the very existence of gods, for to most people the existence of gods was self-evident in the powers of nature and the endurance of human institutions. Doubt in the likelihood of punishment and reward for human conduct was openly expressed, for experience showed that bad people could prosper and righteous ones suffer. Some authors lamented that the rich and powerful were held up as good examples, no matter what their behavior, while the poor could be disdained as outlaws solely because of their poverty. Foster 1996, 797. They fill the oppressor's strong room with refined gold. They empty the beggar's larder of his provisions. They shore up the tyrant whose all is crime. They ruin the weak, they oppress the powerless. Solemnly they speak well of a rich man. He's a king, they say, he has much wealth. They malign a poor man as a thief. They lavish mischief upon him, they conspire to kill him. Some authors responded to the question of whether or not the gods were just by asserting that suffering and redemption from suffering were simply two sides of a god's power, not dependent on justice at all. Others insisted that everyone who suffered misfortune must have done some evil sometime, even if he was unaware of it, and that everyone who committed a misdeed would eventually come to grief, thus justifying moral behavior. One cynical writer remarked that he could train his god to follow him around like a dog making tiresome demands upon his master. Botero 1992, 251-67. Impiety and sacrilege were sometimes committed by enemy kings who violated sanctuaries in warfare. A Sumerian inscription from Lagash, for example, accuses the king of Umma, a nearby city, of sacrilegious behavior, as does an Acadian poem about an Elamite ruler who violated the sanctuary of Enlil at Nippur. When Mesopotamian kings violated foreign sanctuaries, they sometimes felt the need to justify their actions, as when the 8th century Assyrian king Sargon II explained his looting of the temple of the Eurasian god Haldi, which was located somewhere in eastern Anatolia. Impiety and violation of taboos in private life were sometimes considered signs of incipient insanity. The Epic of Error develops the theme of sacrilege in describing a society that had thrown off all restraints and was bent on self-destruction through murder, violence and looting. According to this poem, violence developed its own uncontrollable momentum, destroying good and evil alike and bringing havoc upon palaces, hovels, temples and private homes. This in turn forced the gods to curse and forsake their cities in revulsion at the atrocities of their inhabitants. To the author of the Epic of Error, impious acts could be symptomatic of collective insanity, and he was deeply concerned as to how such social madness could develop in a world supposedly controlled by sage-like deities. Foster 1996, 782. He who did not die in battle will die in the epidemic. He who did not die in the epidemic, the enemy will plunder him. He whom the enemy has not plundered, the bandit will murder him. He whom the bandit did not murder, the king's weapon will vanquish him. He whom the king's weapon did not vanquish, the prince will slay him. He whom the prince did not slay, a thunderstorm will wash him away. He whom the thunderstorm did not wash away, the sun will parch him. Applications of religion in human society. Destiny. Mesopotamian thought was preoccupied by destiny, a belief that a person's success or failure in life was ordained at birth, even written on a tablet in the Netherworld. Because a person's destiny was already decided at birth, his future was in fact his past. Destiny was not directly controlled by the gods but seems to have been understood as impersonal necessity, a hidden given, or a fact in the course of accomplishment. The gods did, however, vouchsafe to observant human beings glimpses of their destinies, long and short term, either in response to questions or through random sights, sounds or actions of potentially ominous significance. Knowledge of one's destiny opened the way to its modification or evasion if the prognosis seemed unfavorable. Rochberg-Halton 1982, Mall-in-a-Bush 1999, 123-9. While one could not significantly change unfavorable character traits or propensities to failure or such a universal destiny as death, certain likelihoods of destiny such as health, happiness and prosperity might be revealed in signs and portents that could be evaluated by a specialist, and divine assistance sought to enhance or alter them. Divination. Divination in a broad sense was the Mesopotamian science of discerning destiny, divine will and intention behind observable phenomena. Botero 1974, Oppenheim 1977, 206-27. Almost anything had potentially positive or negative significance towards understanding a person's destiny: the regular motion of the stars and planets, exceptional celestial occurrences such as meteors or eclipses, atmospheric and meteorological variations, activity of human beings and animals, physical characteristics and placement, normal or abnormal, of inanimate objects, plants and other living things, accidents and common occurrences in human life. Specialists in interpretation of these prognoses used such techniques as historical coincidence, what occurred in the past when a certain omen was seen, analogy and contrast, up, down, left, right, pointing towards or away from, to add up a balance of positive and negative tendencies in the evidence, as in the modern technique of handwriting analysis. The two basic approaches of divination were observation of random phenomena, such as objects lying in the street, or causing phenomena in the hope of a response to a specific question, pouring oil on water, sacrificing a sheep to examine its entrails. Both required specialized training and consultation of large collections of written omens. The consultation was expensive, so was available only to those who had means to pay for it. Some phenomena, such as eclipses or monstrous births, were thought to be significant for public life, with portents for the stability of government and the well-being of the king, so were reported to the royal court along with other local news for evaluation by experts. Other types of omens, such as chance sounds or peculiar behavior of domestic or wild animals, might apply to the person who experienced them, so he could seek professional assistance in interpreting them. Private letters only occasionally refer to consultation with diviners, though literary texts often do, so it is hard to know how important divination was in the life of ordinary citizens. Diviners were not priests but scholars learned in an intellectual endeavor. They sought to develop systematic tools to understand the present and future through observation, study and verification of findings. The arts of the diviner were therefore at the crossroads of human and divine coexistence, seeking to pass from the one to the other sphere by rational means. Magic. Belief in and practice of magic flourished in the environment of Mesopotamian religious belief and practice. Bush 1999. The magician accepted the existence of non-human powers and beings that could be invoked and used by humans. Magic words, for example, possessed in themselves the power to bring about a desired consequence, success in love or business, warding off human hostility, slander, threats, anger and unwanted feelings and desires. Often the magic words were said to originate with a god of magic, not the human speaker. Magic words and rituals could work against more powerful threats such as sorcery, hidden misdeeds of the past, false or unfulfilled oaths, ghosts, demons, and evils of unknown origin. One common technique was to identify the evil as closely as possible, then to bring against it positive forces of a beneficent god such as Ea, Marduk or Asaluhi. More elaborate magical procedure entailed rituals carried out by specialists, such as exorcists, to identify and get rid of the affliction. Signs of affliction might include mental or bodily illness, loss of vitality, sexual dysfunction, alienation, feelings of anxiety or persecution. These might suggest the agency of gods, demons, ghosts, or all of them, which had to be identified and dealt with. Rituals might include symbolic washing off of impurities, burning, or interring evil in symbolic form and using magic words to ensure that the evil itself suffered the same fate as the symbol of it. Exorcists, like diviners, were not priests so much as professionals who specialized in identifying and removing causes of human complaints through mostly magical means. In the case of illness, besides magic formulae and rituals, rational means such as pharmacopoeia, psychiatry, manipulation, poultices and dressings could also be used, thereby combining the practice of medicine with the arts of the magician. Here too religion, magic and human existence intersected to a degree that the activity cannot always be consigned to one or another category. They form rather a continuum between the sphere of human beings and the sphere of the gods that training, practice and skill could bridge. Innovation and reform. Innovation in Mesopotamian religion was usually presented in symbolic terms that can be difficult to evaluate in modern times. A lengthy Sumerian poem, The Exaltation of Ishtar, refers to the elevation of the cult of Ishtar at Uruk over that of Anu, in which Anu joyfully promotes her to the status of Queen of Heaven. No one knows how or why Ishtar's cult gained prominence at Uruk. Perhaps too the cult of Ninurta originally dominated at Nippur, but was displaced at an unknown date by the cult of Enlil, who was called his father, although many scholars believe that the cult of Enlil was in fact original to Nippur. Certain rulers, such as the 6th century BCE Babylonian king Nabonidus, took pride in reviving ancient and forgotten religious practices. This shows that the cult changed over time and that certain practices were abandoned. He is also known for an abortive effort to promote the cult of the moon god Sin, as a personal preference, at Babylon. This caused considerable resentment and was later transformed into a biblical legend of a mad Babylonian king, but they're confused with Nebuchadnezzar II, Nabonidus' better-known predecessor. The Sargonic king Naram-Sin, late 3rd millennium BCE, stated in an inscription that the grateful citizenry of his city, Agade, asked to have him made a god along with the other leading gods of Mesopotamia, but deification of living rulers was not a common practice. Another ruler, Urukagina, or Uruanimgina, of Lagash, commemorated his change of ancient practices, claiming that they were made with divine approval. He stated that he turned over various properties to the gods and that he had changed certain fees, obligations and practices, but the significance of his reforms is disputed. Mesopotamian religion and the Bible. Mesopotamian religion has been of interest to biblical scholars since the discovery in 1872 by George Smith of a flood story in an Assyrian tablet. This proved that non-biblical ancient Near Eastern documents contained material directly pertinent to the Bible. To some thinkers, the uniqueness and integrity of the Bible could therefore no longer be maintained. Leading philologists, especially in Germany, such as Hugo Winkler, Hermann Gunkel, Heinrich Zimmern and Friedrich Delitzsch, staked out different and sometimes contradictory positions in what became known as Pan-Babylonianism or the astral mythological school. The basic tenet of this group was that the civilization of Israel was essentially Babylonian in origin, including its religious ideas, such as monotheism. Winkler, for example, argued that Joshua, Saul and David were actually Babylonian astral deities. Zimmern went on to suggest that Marduk was a forerunner of Jesus. Peter Jensen, a distinguished Assyriologist, argued that Abraham, Jesus and John the Baptist, for example, were borrowed from Babylonian mythology and that the Gilgamesh epic, to him a kind of astral saga, was the basis for the New Testament and the Quran. Outside of Germany more moderate positions were taken, but still implying a strong cultural and religious dependency of Israel upon Babylonia. The extravagant claims of the Pan-Babylonianists eventually collapsed and are not taken seriously today. A broader and more moderate view held that Babylonia was part of the ancient Near Eastern context of the Hebrew Bible, Lambert 1988. Committed Christian and Jewish scholars, for example, often put the Bible first, so to them ancient Near Eastern parallels helped to clarify or even prove the validity of the Bible because they were independent witness to biblical passages. Mesopotamian studies, especially in the United States, became effectively an adjunct of biblical studies. In the period 1880 to 1940, the majority of leading American scholars in the discipline were Protestant clergymen, very much interested in possible biblical connections. To some scholars, such as W. F. Albright, the biblical world came to include the whole of the ancient Near East. There was therefore no need to separate Mesopotamian studies from biblical studies, they were aspects of the same agenda. In this spirit, Albright could entitle one of his most popular books From the Stone Age to Christianity. Albright 1940. According to this, Mesopotamian religion was a preparatio for the more profound religion of Israel, itself a preparation for Christianity. Today, because of the accumulation of new material, a panoramic grasp of the languages and civilizations of the ancient Near East such as Albright enjoyed is impossible to attain, but Albright's fundamental approach remains influential, especially among conservative Christian scholars. Each new discovery of cuneiform tablets elicits a wave of publications asserting biblical parallels, many of them uncertain and far-fetched, even when a millennium or more may have elapsed between the tablets and the relevant portion of the Bible. The biblical scholar M. de Hood, for example, saw parallels bet when the Bible and cuneiform tablets from Ebla in northern Syria, which date to approximately 1,300 years before the Kingdom of David. E. A. Spicer insisted that the patriarchal age of the Bible was reflected in tablets from Nuzi in northern Mesopotamia, early 14th century BCE, although most of his analogies have been discarded in recent years. The discovery of prophetic documents at Mari, 18th century BCE, attracted much discussion, as did comparison of ancient treaties with the biblical covenant. A subtler interconnection between the worlds of the Hebrews and of the Babylonians was provided by what might be called pansemitism, the idea that the Semitic peoples had certain innate mental and emotional characteristics and limitations in common that conditioned their religious values. A concise statement of this view, which is traceable, for example, to the works of the influential French thinker Ernest Renan, will be found in S. A. Cook's contribution The Semites, Temperament and Thought in the Cambridge Ancient History. 1924, Chapter 5, Cook held that Semitic thought was verbal rather than visual, emotional rather than systematic or speculative, and so could not have created such a grand astral system of beliefs as the Pan-Babylonianists had imagined underlay modern Christianity, Judaism and Islam. To Pan-Semitists, Greece, with its alleged superior visual and speculative thought, albeit comparatively shallow religion, was as essential to understanding Christianity as was Judaism. Scholars wrote of the Hebrew and the Greek element in Christianity and European culture. The Pan-Semitists bracketed Judaism, Islam and Babylonia as Semitic in type, but not Christianity. This left the place of the Sumerians in the equation Babylonian equals Semitic difficult to define. The early 20th century historian Edward Meyer, for example, therefore argued that the Semites were the original inhabitants of Mesopotamia and the Sumerians were later invaders, thereby maintaining the originally Semitic character of Mesopotamian civilization. In the period after World War I, some scholars tried to distinguish Sumerian from Semitic thought in Mesopotamian culture. Thus discussion of the relations between Babylonia and the Bible proceeded in an atmosphere charged with faith, skepticism and antisemitism. Some scholars of Mesopotamia sought to declare independence from biblical studies in the 1930s, insisting that Mesopotamia be studied on its own terms, even in isolation, but for most people the main interest of Mesopotamian religions lies in their historical interest and comparison with ancient Greece and the Bible. Studies regularly appear on the Near Eastern background of Greek mythology and culture. Some, such as the work of Cyrus Gordon, are strongly critical of a perceived tendency of classicists to assume that Greece stood alone in the Eastern Mediterranean and was not significantly influenced by Near Eastern, or Semitic, peoples, Gordon 1965. With respect to the Bible, the contextual approach, advocated by scholars such as William W. Hello, makes both comparisons and contrasts, recognizing the autonomy and interdependence of ancient Israel and Mesopotamia. Hello 1997. This steers a middle course between the extremism of the pan-Babylonianists and of those who would build a fence around the Bible and claim that Israel was somehow exempt from the dynamic influences of Mesopotamia, the greatest cultural center in Western Asia during the first millennium BCE. No serious student of the Bible can ignore Mesopotamian civilization, but the religious experiences of both Mesopotamia and the Hebrews have to be understood in their own terms before they can be profitably compared or contrasted. Bibliography. Mesopotamian studies is an international discipline with much important scholarship on religion published in French, German and Italian. Although every effort has been made to favor English-language sources here, a few essential works in French and German must be included. Abush, T. and K. van der Toorn, ed. 1999. Mesopotamian Magic, Textual, Historical and Interpretive Perspective. Groningen, STYX Publications. Excellent volume of essays, useful for the general reader. Albright, W. 1940. From the Stone Age to Christianity, Monotheism and the Historical Process. Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University Press, London, Oxford University Press. Classic statement of his integrative approach to the religions of the ancient Near East. Black, J. and A. Green 1992. Gods, Demons and Symbols of Ancient Mesopotamia, an Illustrated Dictionary. London, British Museum Press, Austin, University of Texas Press. Useful reference work for many topics connected to religion. Botero, J. 1974. Symptoms, Scenas, Écritures. In J. Vernant, ed. Divination et Rationalite. Paris, Editions du Sol, pp 70-197. Best Study of Mesopotamian Divination in all its branches. 1989, Lorsque les dieux faisaient et l'homme, Mythologie Mesopotamienne, Paris, Gallimard. Translation and comments on Sumerian and Acadian mythology. 1992, Mesopotamia, Writing, Reasoning, and the Gods, Trans. Z. Barani N.M. van der Meerup. Chicago, University of Chicago Press. Collection of essays on diverse topics, some pertinent to Mesopotamian religion. 2001, Religion in Ancient Mesopotamia, Trans. T. L. Fagan. Chicago, University of Chicago Press. Sensitive and Penetrating Study of Mesopotamian Religion. Cohen, M. 1993. The Cultic Calendars of the Ancient Near East. Bethesda, Maryland, CDL Press. Comprehensive Survey, with reference to biblical connections. Daly, S. 1989. Myths from Mesopotamia. Oxford, Oxford University Press. Excellent translation and comments on Assyro-Babylonian myths. Dorm, E. 1945. Les religions de Babylonie et d'Assyrie. Paris, Presses Universitaires de France. Classic study still well worth consulting. Durand, J. M. 1988, Archives épistolaires de Marie, I1, Archives royales de Marie XXVI. Paris, Editions Recherches sur les Civilisations. Contains the best and most authoritative study of prophecy from Marie, replacing all previous works on this subject. Edzard, D. 1965. Mesopotamian, Die Mythologie der Sumer und Akkadier. In H. Hosig, ed., Mythen in Vorderen Orient. Stuttgart, Ernst Klett Verlag = Wörterbuch der Mythologie, pp 19-139. Very useful compendium of information on Mesopotamian religion in condensed form. Thurm, V. ed. 1950. Ancient Religions. New York, The Philosophical Library, originally published as Forgotten Religions. Contains chapters on Sumer, Kramer, and Assyria and Babylonia, Oppenheim, now mostly out of date. Finkel, I.N.M., Geller, eds. 1997. Sumerian Gods and Their Representations. Groningen, STYX Publications. Collection of essays on Sumerian religion, intended for the specialist. Foster, born in 1996. Before the Muses, an anthology of Acadian literature. 2nd ed., Bethesda, Maryland, CDL Press. Translations and notes on Assyro-Babylonian mythological texts, as well as hymns, prayers and other texts of importance to the study of religion. 3rd and Revised Edition 2005. ed. 2001. The Epic of Gilgamesh. New York, W. W. Norton and Company. New translations of Sumerian, Acadian and Hittite Gilgamesh with critical essays. Frankfurt, H. 1996. The Art and Architecture of the Ancient Orient. 1st ed., Hardmansworth, Penguin, 1971. New Haven, Yale University Press. George, A. 1999. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a new translation. London, Allen Lane. Authoritative translation of the epic and its Sumerian forerunners. Gordon, circa 1965. The Common Background of Greek and Hebrew Civilization. New York, W. W. Norton and Company. Controversial, pioneering study stressing the cultural debt of ancient Greece to the Near East. Hello, W. 1983. Cult Statue and Divine Image, a Preliminary Study. In W. Hello, J. Moyer and L. Purdue, eds, Scripture in Context, 2, more essays on the comparative method. Winona Lake, I.D., Eisenbrauns, pp. 1-17. Sumerian Religion. Journal of the Institute of Archaeology of Tel Aviv University, Tel Aviv, Occasional Publications 1, pp. 15-35. Hello, W. and K. Younger, ed., 1997. The Context of Scripture, Canonical Compositions from the Biblical World. Leiden, E. J. Brill. Compendium of numerous ancient Near Eastern texts, including important Sumerian religious texts, translated into English. Harris, R. 1991. Inanna Ishtar as Paradox and a Coincidence of Opposites. History of Religions 30, 261-78. Heidel, A. 1951. The Babylonian Genesis. 2nd ed., Chicago, University of Chicago Press. Although the translations are out of date, Heidel's discussion of biblical parallels to Mesopotamian creation stories gives a good example of a conservative Christian approach. Jacobson, T. 1976. The Treasures of Darkness, A History of Mesopotamian Religion. New Haven, Yale University Press. Major Integrative Study of Mesopotamian Religion. 1987a. The Harps That Once. New Haven, Yale University Press. Important anthology of Sumerian literature in translation, including myths and other religious texts. 1987b. Mesopotamian Religion. In M. Iliad, ed., Encyclopedia of Religion. New York, Macmillan, London, Collier Macmillan. Jastrow, M. 1898. The Religion of Babylonia and Assyria. New York and London, Putnam's. One of the first comprehensive presentations of Mesopotamian religion, widely used by later authors, now antiquated. Kramer, S. 1961. Sumerian Mythology, A Study of Spiritual and Literary Achievement in the 3rd Millennium BC Revised ed., New York, Harper and Row. Though outdated in many respects, a lively presentation of Sumerian mythology for the general reader. 1969, The Sacred Marriage Rite, Aspects of Faith, Myth, and Ritual in Ancient Sumer. Bloomington and London, Indiana University Press, Revised, Expanded French Edition, Le Mariage Sacre à Sumer et à Babylone, trans. J. Bottereau. Paris, Berg International, 1983. Krauss, F. 1990. The Role of Temples from the 3rd Dynasty of Ur to the 1st Dynasty of Babylon, trans. B. Foster. Monographs on the Ancient Near East 2 Fascicle 4, Malibu. Lambert, W. 1975. The Cosmology of Sumer and Babylon. In C. Bleecker and M. Lowe, eds. Ancient Cosmologies. London, Allen and Unwin, pp. 42-65. Concise, authoritative survey. 1988, Old Testament Mythology in its Near Eastern Context. Vetus Testamentum Supplement 40, 124-43. 1990, Ancient Mesopotamian Gods, Superstition, Philosophy, Theology. Revue de l'Histoire des Religions 207, 115-30. Nemet-Nejat, K. 1998. Daily Life in Ancient Mesopotamia. Westport, Connecticut and London, Greenwood Press. Good introductory book for the general reader. Chapter 9 is on religion. Oppenheim, A. 1961. The Mesopotamian Temple. In G. Wright and D. Friedman, eds. The Biblical Archaeologist Reader I. Garden City, New York, Anchor Books, pp. 158-69. 1977, Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. Revised and completed by Erica Rayner. Chicago, University of Chicago Press. Excellent, sometimes capricious chapters on Mesopotamian religious belief and practice. Parpola, S. 1997. Assyrian Prophesies, State Archives of Assyria 9. Helsinki, Helsinki University Press. Porter, born in 2000. One God or Many? Concepts of Divinity in the Ancient World. Transactions of the Casco Bay Archaeological Institute 1. Contains 2 essays on Assyrian concepts of divinity. Reallexikon der Assyriologie. Berlin, De Gruyter, in progress. Contains full information on Mesopotamian deities and other religious topics, with bibliography, and some important articles in English. Rochberg-Holton, F. 1982. Fate and Divination in Mesopotamia. Archiv für Orientforschung 19, 363-71. Rogers, R. 1940. The Religion of Babylonia and Assyria, especially in its relations to Israel. New York, Eaton and Main. Antiquated Forerunner to Albright. Romer, W. 1969. Religion of Ancient Mesopotamia. In G. Weidengren, ed., Historia Religionum, Handbook for the History of Religions I, Religions of the Past. Leiden, E. J. Brill. 115-94. Van Dijk, J. 1971. Sumerisch Religion. In J. Asmussen and J. Les, eds., Handbuch der Religionsgeschichte 1. Göttingen, Van den Hoek and Ruprecht, pp. 431-96. Difficult reading for the non-specialist, but filled with original ideas and interpretations of key Sumerian religious concepts.